The large station called Horizon Point floated quietly between the stars, and from the outside it looked peaceful, almost like a giant lantern hanging in the dark. But inside the station, people moved around with tense steps. Every corridor felt heavy, as if the walls themselves understood that something big was about to happen. Representatives from many worlds had traveled long distances to gather here. They came with hopes, fears, doubts, and expectations. Everyone talked about the same thing. This time, finally, a real peace agreement might be created. The galaxy had waited for this moment for decades. While other delegations had groups of advisors and escorts, the human side was simple. Only one human had been sent to speak for Earth. They called him the representative because his role was clear and serious. He had spent many years handling difficult discussions between planets, and even those who disagreed with Earth respected how calmly he spoke. He never raised his voice. He never used harsh words. He tried to make every side feel understood, even when tensions were high. Some people believed that if anyone could help guide the meeting toward peace, it would be him. When he arrived at Horizon Point, he stepped out of the shuttle slowly, taking a moment to absorb the atmosphere. The air smelled different here, slightly metallic, hinting at the station's age. Security officers guided him through a long walkway where glass walls showed the endless view of space. He kept his hands folded behind his back and walked with steady steps. His face showed no excitement, but inside, a quiet hope lived. Maybe this meeting would finally stop the small conflicts that had been draining many worlds for years. He reached the area where members of other delegations were assembling. Some aliens stood in groups, whispering quietly. Others sat alone, reviewing documents or adjusting communication devices. The representative moved among them with an expression of calm focus. Some delegates greeted him politely. A few nodded with respect. There were also those who avoided looking at him, uncertain about Earth's growing influence. But he did not let that bother him. He understood that fear often hid itself behind cold behavior. A tall, soft-spoken attendant from the station guided him toward the negotiation hall. On the way, they passed through several security checks. The station wanted to make sure nothing would disturb the summit. Cameras watched every hall. Guards stood alert at every doorway. It was clear that even the organizers felt the pressure of this historic meeting. If things went wrong, the consequences could spread through the galaxy like ripples in a pond. Everyone wanted stability. Everyone wanted safety. But wanting something and being ready to work for it were not always the same. The representative entered the main hall and looked around quietly. The room was wide, with a circular arrangement of seats. Each seat represented a world or alliance. Soft lights floated gently above the table, giving the room a warm, steady glow. Some delegates were already seated. Others stood near their seats, stretching or speaking in low voices. At the far end, translators adjusted their equipment, preparing for hours of difficult dialogue. Every sound in the hall seemed sharper than normal, as if the room itself was waiting. The representative took his designated seat and placed his notes on the smooth table. He did not bring a large pile of documents like others. His approach had always been simple: listen first, speak second. Many of the delegates believed humans had become too bold in recent years. Yet almost all of them agreed on one thing. The representative was different. He did not try to dominate conversations. He did not twist words to confuse others. He spoke with sincerity, and sincerity was rare in a place filled with politics. As more delegations arrived, the noise level rose. A group from a distant system argued in their own language, their shapes shifting subtly with emotion. Another group carried heavy devices that recorded everything happening around them. A pair of delegates from a water world even brought small breathing chambers to stay healthy in the dry air. All these different beings gathered for the same goal, yet the distances between their cultures were so wide that misunderstandings could happen at any moment. That was why this meeting mattered so much. If they could learn to trust each other here, trust could grow across the galaxy. The representative watched them quietly. He knew these meetings were never easy. Behind every delegate sat entire civilizations with their own fears and struggles. Some worlds worried that signing a peace agreement would make them seem weak. Others believed peace would slow their expansion. A few feared that their old enemies would gain more advantages. The representative understood these worries. He did not judge them. Instead, he focused on the single thing everyone shared. None of them wanted endless conflict. No planet wanted its people to live in fear. He pulled out a small device that displayed the agenda for the first session. It was simple, almost hopeful. Opening statements. Exchange of concerns. Review of proposed terms. It made everything sound clean and organized. But he knew the reality would be different. Behind the polite words and soft smiles, deeper emotions would unfold. Still, he believed that patience could make a difference. If he kept his tone gentle and his explanations clear, maybe others would mirror that calmness. A soft chime rang through the hall, signaling that the meeting would begin soon. Delegates rushed to their seats. The tension grew thicker, like humidity before a storm. A station officer stepped forward, welcoming everyone and reminding them of the purpose of the summit. His voice echoed through the hall, steady but hopeful. As he spoke, the representative looked at each face around the table. Some delegates looked tired, some determined, some suspicious. He wondered how many of them truly wanted peace, and how many simply wanted to shape it in their favor. He leaned back slightly in his chair, letting out a slow breath. He reminded himself of the promise he made before leaving Earth. No matter how complicated the talks became, he would remain steady. He would not let frustration or pressure influence his choices. He would speak honestly. He would listen carefully. Peace was not built with fast words or quick agreements. It grew slowly, like a plant. It needed patience and the willingness to understand others. When the first speaker began their opening statement, the representative paid close attention. The speaker talked about the past years of unrest, the loss experienced across many worlds, and the desire for unity. The words were touching, but the representative had heard similar speeches many times before. He looked for sincerity small signs, such as the tone, the eyes, the pause between sentences. He tried to understand not just what the speaker said, but what they truly felt. Other speakers followed. Some were emotional, their voices shaking as they remembered the pain their people had faced. Others were calm, almost too calm, speaking like they were reading a script prepared by others. The representative took mental notes. He knew these first statements would set the tone for the whole summit. When his turn came, he stood slowly, keeping his hands relaxed at his sides. He looked around the hall, meeting the eyes of several delegates. He thanked everyone for coming and expressed humanity's hope for a peaceful future. He talked about how the galaxy had become too connected to allow old grudges to control the future. He said that Earth was ready to cooperate, ready to compromise where possible, and ready to support a fair solution. His voice was steady, simple, and without dramatic gestures. He spoke not like a performer, but like someone who genuinely believed in what he was saying. When he sat down, a strange quietness filled the hall. Several delegates exchanged glances. A few nodded in appreciation. Others looked thoughtful. For a moment, the tension seemed to soften. A small spark of possibility formed in the air. But the representative knew it would not last for long. These gatherings always began with polite words. The real challenges would appear when deeper discussions started. Still, he allowed himself a brief moment of hope. If even one or two factions showed true willingness to cooperate, progress could be made. As the session continued, he kept listening carefully. He watched reactions, noted small shifts in mood, and observed how certain topics made the whole room react. Every tiny detail mattered. Every pause, every hesitation, every forced smile told him more than the spoken words. After several long hours, the session paused for a break. Delegates stood, stretched, or walked outside to talk with their teams. The representative stayed seated for a moment, resting his hands on the table. His thoughts moved quietly. So many worlds were represented here. So many different histories, fears, and ambitions. And yet, everyone claimed they wanted peace. He wondered how many of them truly meant it. When he finally stood and walked toward the hall's exit, he felt a mixture of tiredness and determination. He knew the path ahead would not be easy. Peace never came easily. But as long as he stayed calm and honest, he believed he could guide conversations in the right direction. He looked out through the glass wall of the corridor. The stars outside were bright and endless. Somewhere among them, billions of people hoped this meeting would change their future. He carried their expectations quietly, without boasting, without fear. He did not need grand speeches. He needed steady steps. And as he walked down the long corridor of Horizon Point, he reminded himself of the one truth he had always followed. Peace was not built by force. The second day of the summit began quietly, but there was a tension in the air that made the corridors feel heavier than the day before. Delegates arrived earlier than scheduled, some moving quickly, others lingering with hesitant steps. Horizon Point, the massive station suspended between two bright stars, seemed almost alive with anticipation. Every step echoed on the smooth floors, and the hum of energy from the station systems added a subtle vibration to the walls. For the human representative, this was familiar territory. He had seen tension like this many times, but the stakes today felt higher than ever. The negotiation hall was already filling with delegates when he arrived. Some had traveled thousands of light years, crossing dangerous sectors just to be here. Many wore the uniforms and garments of their worlds, which varied in shapes, colors, and textures. Some had skin that shimmered in subtle shades of blue and green. Others had multiple limbs that moved in careful, synchronized motions. A few carried devices that seemed almost like living creatures, shifting colors and shapes as if they were part of the alien itself. Despite all the differences, each one shared the same purpose: to shape the future of the galaxy. At first, the morning session seemed calm. Speakers took turns presenting their initial positions, reviewing the past conflicts, and expressing hopes for resolution. The human representative listened with the same patience he had shown the day before. He did not interrupt or challenge anyone yet. Instead, he focused on understanding each faction's true concerns. He noticed small gestures that hinted at hidden fears: a flick of a tentacle, a slight shift in posture, or a quiet exchange between two delegates. These subtle movements told him more than words alone could. However, as the discussions moved forward, the calm began to crack. Two of the larger factions started questioning each other's motives. They accused one another of unfair trade practices and old territorial violations. The air grew tense, and even the translators struggled to keep up with the rapid exchanges. The representative felt the weight of the room pressing in, not with hostility directed at him, but with the collective anxiety of so many worlds watching. He could sense the quiet murmurs of advisors and aides who hoped for peace but feared confrontation. The human representative decided it was time to speak, not forcefully, but with clarity. He reminded the delegates that peace could not be achieved if accusations and blame overshadowed honest dialogue. He spoke in simple terms, choosing words that could cross cultural barriers. He emphasized shared interests rather than old grudges. His tone was calm, almost gentle, yet firm enough to be noticed in the growing noise of arguments. Some delegates nodded, appreciating the attempt to center the discussion. Others stared, skeptical, unsure if a single human could shift decades of distrust. The tension, however, only intensified after his intervention. A representative from a war-torn world argued loudly, insisting that Earth should take sides and support their claims immediately. The human representative countered not with anger, but with careful reasoning. He explained that peace required fairness, that no side could be favored over another, and that agreements must reflect truth rather than convenience. His words were measured, yet the other faction seemed unwilling to accept them. The room's atmosphere thickened like a storm about to break. Some delegates began whispering among themselves, exchanging looks that suggested frustration. A few advisors glanced nervously at the human representative, unsure if he could handle the mounting pressure. Despite this, he remained composed, listening carefully, allowing the others to speak fully before responding. He knew that in negotiations, listening was often more powerful than speaking. Every pause, every hesitation, every moment of silence could carry more weight than the loudest argument. As the hours passed, the issues became more complex. Smaller factions started raising concerns about resources, trade routes, and mutual defense agreements. Many of their points were valid, but others were designed to provoke stronger parties, to test patience, or to gain advantage. The human representative carefully noted each claim, mentally categorizing them into concerns that could be addressed immediately and those that needed more time. His mind worked quietly, like a strategist preparing a careful plan while appearing unhurried. In one heated exchange, a faction accused another of secretly building weapons in violation of prior agreements. Voices rose, gestures became sharp, and the noise threatened to drown out any rational discussion. The human representative waited, then spoke softly, reminding everyone that accusations without evidence could destroy the fragile possibility of consensus. His calm presence had a subtle effect. Some delegates lowered their voices. Some even paused to reconsider their words. Though the conflict did not vanish, his intervention prevented it from escalating into outright hostility. Between sessions, he walked quietly through the halls of Horizon Point. The station's corridors were long and reflective, making it feel as if he was walking among endless stars. He observed delegates conversing in small groups, some with laughter that seemed almost nervous, others with expressions of deep concern. Everywhere he looked, he saw the same tension, the desperate desire for peace mixed with fear of being taken advantage of. He knew that the summit's success depended not only on agreements, but on trust, and trust was always the most fragile element in any negotiation. During the afternoon session, matters became even more delicate. One faction proposed a plan that would shift resources unfairly in their favor. The proposal was detailed and technically sound, but the human representative immediately recognized the imbalance. He raised questions, not as a challenge, but as a means to highlight fairness. He asked how the plan would affect smaller factions, and whether it truly addressed the underlying issues of conflict. Some delegates tried to dismiss his concerns, claiming he did not understand the complexities of interstellar politics. Yet his calm, precise words forced them to reconsider, at least momentarily. It was during these moments that he realized something important. Many factions came to the table, hoping to win rather than to compromise. They had layered strategies, hidden agendas, and subtle pressures to test the patience of others. The human representative understood this, but he did not allow frustration to cloud his judgment. He reminded himself that peace was not about winning a single argument. It was about creating conditions where all parties could feel respected. His approach was simple, human, and sincere. It was not flashy or aggressive, but it carried weight because of its honesty. As the day moved toward its final hours, the discussions began circling back to earlier points. Some factions had softened slightly, influenced by careful questioning and patient listening. Others remained firm, unwilling to concede any advantage. The representative watched the dynamics with a quiet focus. He realized that true progress in these talks would require more than clever arguments. It would require empathy, understanding, and the courage to speak truthfully, even when it was uncomfortable. Finally, a short break was called before the evening session. Delegates left the room, some walking quickly to confer with their teams, others lingering with expressions of deep thought. The human representative remained seated for a moment, reflecting on the day. He had listened to countless complaints, suggestions, and accusations. He had responded with calm reasoning, sometimes challenged, sometimes ignored, but always with the intent to guide the discussions toward fairness. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, and that not everyone at the table would welcome honesty or integrity. Even as he prepared for the next session, he understood one key truth. The summit's outcome depended not on power or intimidation, but on the choices each individual made in that hall. Every word mattered. Every gesture mattered. Every moment of patience mattered. And above all, he understood that one person, if steadfast and truthful, could influence the course of history, even in a room filled with centuries of mistrust. The human representative stood and walked slowly to the hall's exit, passing groups of delegates along the way. Some offered polite nods, acknowledging his presence. Others avoided eye contact, uncertain about how to respond. He did not seek approval or recognition. He moved with the quiet determination of someone who knew that real work often went unnoticed, that influence could be subtle. And that integrity required courage. As he stepped into the corridor overlooking the endless expanse of stars, he took a deep breath. Beyond the station, countless worlds waited, their citizens unaware of the intense discussions happening at Horizon Point. For him, the stakes were not just political, they were human. Every decision, every question, every moment of honesty could affect the lives of millions, even billions, across the galaxy. And so, he prepared himself for the next round of discussions, knowing that patience, clarity, and truth would be his strongest tools. The night fell slowly over the station. Lights flickered softly as systems adjusted to the dimming schedules. Delegates returned to their quarters to rest or review notes, but the human representative chose to walk along the observation deck. He looked at the stars stretching endlessly in every direction, feeling the weight of responsibility and the quiet hope that guided him. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more arguments, and deeper tests of patience. But he understood one. The morning of the third day at Horizon Point began with an unusual stillness. The corridors were quieter than the previous days, but the air was thick with tension. Delegates arrived, moving more carefully than before, as if each step could change the fate of the meeting. The human representative walked along the polished floors, his posture calm, but his mind alert. He knew that today could bring breakthroughs or disaster. He had seen negotiations reach dead ends before, and he understood that this day might test patience, honesty, and courage in ways no one expected. When he entered the negotiation hall, he noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Some delegates were whispering urgently in small clusters, their expressions uneasy. Others avoided speaking altogether, watching carefully and calculating the reactions of their rivals. The first speaker, representing a faction that had suffered heavy losses in past conflicts, stood tall and began reviewing grievances from previous years. Their words were measured, almost rehearsed, but the emotion behind them was unmistakable. Families, homes, and livelihoods had been destroyed, and the speaker's tone reflected the weight of those losses. The human representative listened quietly, observing not just the words, but the subtle cues hidden in posture, hand gestures, and eye movements. He noticed the flicker of tension between delegates seated nearby and understood immediately that alliances were forming quietly in corners of the room. He knew that these alliances could be useful or dangerous, depending on how the discussions unfolded. Today, the stakes were higher than ever, because one misstep could turn frustration into open hostility. After the opening statements, the debate intensified. One of the larger factions introduced a proposal that clearly favored their own interests, ignoring the concerns of smaller and less powerful worlds. They presented it with precision, citing trade statistics, defense agreements, and historical claims. The representative recognized immediately that the terms were unfair, even though they appeared logical on the surface. He also knew that challenging this proposal would not be easy. Some delegates were already leaning in, murmuring agreement, tempted by the promise of immediate gain. The representative raised his hand slightly and spoke with calm authority. He pointed out the potential consequences of the proposal, not as an attack, but as a caution. He asked how smaller factions would survive if the plan were implemented, and he reminded the assembly that long-term stability required fairness, not just short-term advantage. A few delegates nodded in agreement, grateful for the perspective, but others frowned. They whispered among themselves, clearly frustrated that a human alone would dare question their carefully crafted plan. The tension in the room escalated quickly. One delegate, whose species had a sharp, almost metallic voice, stood abruptly and accused the human representative of misunderstanding their culture and politics. The hall grew louder, voices overlapping, some rising in anger. The representative remained seated for a moment, taking a slow breath. He understood that arguing back with force would only inflame the situation. Instead, he chose to speak next with deliberate clarity. His words were simple but firm, appealing to shared values, highlighting common goals, and reminding everyone that peace required compromise from all sides. Even with his calm approach, some factions continued to push their advantage. A representative from a desert planet brought up an old conflict, twisting historical events to justify their current demands. Another faction, representing a water-based species, hinted that humanity had secretly taken sides in previous skirmishes, though there was no evidence to support the claim. The room grew heated, and it became clear that the discussion was moving away from cooperation and toward confrontation. The human representative realized that the summit was at a critical turning point. He understood that if this day ended like the previous ones, with polite words and little progress, the window for meaningful agreements could close entirely. He focused his thoughts, considering how to respond without anger or judgment. He knew that patience alone might not be enough. The delegates needed to see a human willing to speak the truth, even when it was uncomfortable. As the debate continued, small actions in the room revealed deeper intentions. Delegates shifted in their seats, whispered to aides, and exchanged subtle signals. The representative observed everything carefully. He noticed that some factions were no longer listening to the words being spoken. They were watching reactions, testing boundaries, seeking weakness. He realized that honesty would not be enough if no one was willing to act fairly. He needed to be clear, firm, and unwavering. Suddenly, one of the larger factions introduced a new clause that directly targeted Earth and its allies. They suggested restrictions on trade, movement, and technology transfers, framed as necessary safeguards. The representative's heart remained steady, but inside, he felt the weight of responsibility. Millions of humans and allies would be affected if these terms were accepted. He spoke immediately, addressing the assembly with a voice calm but strong. He explained why the clause was unacceptable, pointing out its potential for harm and its lack of fairness. The room erupted. Voices rose, some in agreement, some in outrage. Delegates gestured wildly, some leaning forward, some standing, others whispering furiously to their aides. The hall became a storm of accusations, counterclaims, and rising tension. The human representative listened carefully, letting each side present their arguments fully. He did not interrupt. He did not shout. He understood that controlling his own reaction was as important as controlling the discussion. During the chaos, he noticed subtle shifts in attitude. Some delegates, who had appeared eager to dominate the talks, now hesitated, realizing that fairness could not be ignored. Others, however, seemed determined to push the boundaries, testing patience and trying to gain every possible advantage. The representative realized that the summit was no longer about shared peace. It had become a contest of power, strategy, and endurance. He took a moment to speak again. His words were brief but precise. He reminded everyone that peace built on manipulation, lies, or unfair advantages would be fragile and temporary. He asked the delegates to consider the long-term consequences of their actions, not just immediate gain. Some listened, some frowned, and others rolled their eyes. But even a few who reflected quietly represented a small victory. The intensity continued to grow. A delegate from a highly militarized world accused Earth of secretly supporting one faction over another, citing unverifiable claims and twisting past events. Another faction accused a third of intentionally spreading misinformation to sabotage agreements. The hall was filled with tension, so thick it could almost be felt in the air. The human representative remained calm, speaking only when necessary, always appealing to fairness, truth, and shared responsibility. By mid-afternoon, it was clear that the summit had reached a breaking point. Many delegates were exhausted, their voices strained, their expressions tight with frustration. Yet the disputes showed no sign of ending. The human representative realized that the remaining discussions could either resolve the conflicts or completely collapse the talks. He weighed his options carefully. He understood that sometimes words alone could not resolve fundamental dishonesty or manipulation. He decided that patience alone would not be enough. He could no longer allow discussions to continue when certain factions had no intention of reaching genuine agreements. He calmly reviewed his notes, observed the subtle reactions of delegates, and prepared himself to take a stand. He understood that the next moment could define not only the outcome of the summit, but also the integrity of his own principles. As the session continued, he noticed one final, crucial detail. A faction representing a distant, resource-rich world had begun drafting terms that would force Earth to accept limitations it could not agree to. These terms were cleverly disguised as mutual benefits, but the representative recognized the imbalance immediately. The clause would shift control, power, and influence unfairly toward certain factions, while leaving others vulnerable. He understood that if this clause were accepted, the summit would no longer serve peace. It would serve the advantage of a few. He took a slow breath and prepared to speak, knowing that his words could disrupt the meeting entirely. The room was filled with tension, so dense it felt almost physical. Delegates whispered urgently. Advisors exchanged anxious glances, and even translators paused, sensing the shift in mood. He could feel the weight of responsibility pressing on him, the weight of representing millions of humans and countless allies who relied on integrity, fairness, and justice. When he spoke, his voice was calm, deliberate, and unshakable. He explained why the proposed clause was unacceptable, highlighting the risks, the imbalance, and the dishonesty behind it. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He simply stated the truth with clarity and precision. The room fell silent for a brief, tense moment. Delegates stared at him, some in shock, some in frustration, and a few in quiet admiration. His words had cut through the noise, demanding attention without aggression. For the first time that day, the human representative sensed that the direction of the summit had changed, even if only slightly. Some delegates leaned back, reconsidering their position. Others muttered in disagreement, unwilling to see. The morning of the fourth day at Horizon Point carried a strange mix of tension and anticipation. The air felt heavy, thick with the unspoken knowledge that something decisive was about to happen. Delegates arrived with hurried steps, some whispering among themselves, others staring silently at the floor. The human representative walked along the corridors with calm, measured strides, his expression serene, but his mind alert. He had watched the summit unfold over the past 3 days, seen the subtle and not so subtle attempts to manipulate and dominate, and understood that the negotiations were approaching a critical turning point. When he entered the negotiation hall, he felt the energy of the room shift. Some delegates were already tense from yesterday's heated discussions. Others appeared wary, cautious of each other and of the human's quiet presence. For hours, discussions had focused on technical details and procedural arguments. But today, the stakes had grown personal. Every delegate seemed to carry the weight of their world's expectations. Every glance, every gesture hinted at impatience, suspicion, or a quiet hope. The representative took his seat calmly, placing his hands lightly on the smooth surface of the table. He observed each delegate, noting the subtle expressions that betrayed their true feelings: excitement, fear, greed, or doubt. The session began with a routine review of proposals. But the calm was short-lived. One of the larger factions presented a new clause in the treaty that heavily favored their own interests. They framed it as a necessary adjustment for stability, but the human representative recognized immediately that it was a trap. This clause would give them power over trade, technology, and defense while leaving smaller factions, including Earth, vulnerable. Some delegates nodded in agreement, tempted by promises of gain. Others frowned, sensing the imbalance, but uncertain how to challenge it. The room seemed to pulse with tension, the kind that precedes a storm. The human representative stayed quiet at first, listening carefully as the faction laid out their arguments. He understood that reacting too quickly could provoke conflict. He measured his words, preparing to speak not with anger, but with clarity and principle. When he finally raised his voice, it was steady and deliberate. He addressed the hall with calm authority, explaining why the clause was unfair, how it would destabilize the fragile trust they were trying to build, and why peace built on manipulation and advantage was no peace at all. The room went silent for a brief, tense moment. Delegates glanced at each other, some nodding subtly, others frowning with frustration. His words had struck a nerve. For the first time, the room seemed to pause and consider the human perspective. Some delegates whispered to their aides, consulting quickly, while others muttered under their breath, clearly annoyed by being challenged. Yet, in that silence, the human representative felt a small, quiet victory. He had spoken truth, without shouting, without threats, and without compromise of principle. Suddenly, one of the larger factions reacted with anger. A representative rose abruptly, their multiple limbs gesturing sharply, voice rising with frustration. They accused Earth of attempting to dominate discussions, suggesting that the human was overstepping their role. The hall erupted in voices, arguments overlapping, and tempers flaring. Some delegates shouted in their own languages, while translators struggled to keep pace. The noise threatened to drown out reason, and the delicate balance of the summit seemed on the verge of collapse. The human representative remained seated, observing carefully. He knew that responding with anger would only escalate the conflict. Instead, he focused on maintaining calm, letting his presence speak as much as his words. He allowed the other faction to finish their argument, listened to the murmurs, the whispers, the subtle movements of hands and eyes. He understood that in this room, true influence came not from volume, but from clarity, honesty, an unwavering commitment to principle. As the debate continued, it became clear that some factions had no real intention of reaching a fair agreement. Their goal was advantage, power, or leverage. They twisted historical events, manipulated statistics, and attempted to frame Earth as biased, all while presenting themselves as neutral. The human representative understood the stakes. He realized that continuing to negotiate under these conditions could lead to a treaty that would be unfair and dangerous, not just for Earth, but for the smaller worlds and innocent populations across the galaxy. For a moment, he allowed himself to reflect quietly. He thought of the millions of humans and countless allies who relied on him to act with integrity. He thought of the families and children whose lives could be affected by a treaty built on lies and manipulation. He realized that compromise was only honorable when the compromise was fair. Compromise that rewarded deceit or punished truth was no compromise at all. It was surrender. The session grew louder as the larger faction pressed their point, demanding immediate agreement. Delegates whispered to their teams, exchanged notes, and shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The atmosphere was charged, the kind that could ignite anger or fear at the slightest provocation. The human representative felt the weight of the moment, the weight of every life and world that would be impacted by his next actions. He took a deep, steady breath and made a decision. No longer would he participate in discussions that were dishonest or manipulative. He would not remain silent, but he also would not play along with tactics designed to force compliance. The moment demanded a clear, definitive action. The human representative rose slowly from his seat. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, calm, yet full of purpose. All eyes in the hall turned toward him. Even the most aggressive delegates paused, curious and slightly alarmed. He spoke, his voice firm but controlled. Peace cannot be built on manipulation, lies, or unfair advantage. If the discussions here cannot be honest, I cannot participate. Earth will not remain in talks that are not sincere. We cannot accept agreements that threaten fairness, justice, and truth. His words were simple, yet powerful, cutting through the tension and reaching every corner of the hall. Some delegates gasped softly, others frowned, and a few leaned back in silent admiration. His message was clear. Integrity mattered more than compromise for the sake of appearance. Without further words, he turned and walked toward the exit. Every step was calm, measured, deliberate. Delegates watched, some in disbelief, some in quiet respect. A few whispered urgently to their aides, trying to understand what this meant. The human representative did not look back. He did not argue, did not justify, and did not falter. His walk alone carried the weight of principle, the quiet authority of someone willing to act in truth, even when it might anger others or change the course of history. As he left the hall, a strange stillness settled over the room. The noise of arguments faded for a moment, replaced by the realization that one human had chosen action over compromise, principle over convenience. The delegates shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that the presence of honesty could not be ignored. Some whispered among themselves, realizing that the summit might collapse without a shift in behavior. Others, however, seemed frustrated, unwilling to face the truth of their own manipulations. In the corridors outside the hall, the human representative paused briefly to collect his thoughts. He looked through the wide glass windows of Horizon Point, at the vast stars stretching endlessly in every direction. He felt the quiet weight of responsibility, knowing that his decision would reverberate far beyond this station, across worlds and populations who relied on fairness and truth. He did not feel pride or triumph, only calm clarity. He had acted as he believed was right, and that was all that mattered. Back inside the hall, the departure of the human representative caused an immediate stir. Delegates muttered to each other. Advisors whispered urgent instructions, and some factions began to reconsider their positions, unsure of how to proceed without Earth's stabilizing presence. The tension, once focused on arguments and proposals, shifted to uncertainty. The human's quiet action had become a powerful statement. In a room filled with centuries of mistrust and political maneuvering, the decision of one human to walk away had created ripples that no one could ignore. As the hours passed, The remaining delegates struggled to continue discussions. Without Earth's voice guiding fairness and clarity, arguments intensified, alliances shifted, and tempers flared. The summit that had begun with hope now teetered on the edge of collapse. Observers across the galaxy followed the developments closely, sending updates to their home worlds. Some praised the human representative for his courage, while others criticized the action as stubborn or uncooperative. Yet even critics could not deny the impact of a single, principled stand. The human representative did not return to the negotiation hall. Instead, he walked along the observation decks of Horizon Point, letting the vastness of space remind him of perspective. Stars shimmered in distant galaxies, planets spun silently, and civilizations far away awaited outcomes that he had influenced by a single, deliberate choice. He thought not of recognition or reward, but of responsibility and truth. He understood that the hardest decisions often required stepping away from a room full of pressure and remaining faithful to what was right. As night fell over the station, delegates returned to their quarters, some X. After the human representative walked out of the negotiation hall, an uneasy silence fell over Horizon Point. The room, once buzzing with discussion and argument, now felt strangely empty. Delegates shifted in their seats, exchanging glances that carried questions, doubt, and frustration. The air was thick with tension, and for the first time, it seemed that no one knew what to do next. Those who had been trying to dominate the discussions felt unsettled. Those who had been hesitant before suddenly found themselves needing to take sides. Without the steady presence of the human representative to guide fairness, the fragile balance of the summit began to unravel. Whispers spread quickly through the hall. Advisors huddled with their delegates, offering suggestions and strategies. Some argued that they should continue negotiations as if nothing had happened. Others, however, saw the human's departure as a warning, a sign that truth and fairness could not be ignored. Tension grew with every passing moment. It was clear to everyone that the summit had reached a critical tipping point. Decisions made now would have consequences far beyond the walls of Horizon Point. Arguments erupted almost immediately. Delegates who had been quietly observing began to speak up, sometimes with anger, sometimes with fear. A faction that had been waiting for an opportunity to assert dominance saw a chance to push through a proposal that favored them heavily. Another group, seeing the shift, accused their rivals of exploiting the absence of the human representative to manipulate the council. Voices overlapped. Accusations flew. The hall, once a place of hope for resolution, now felt like a battlefield of words. Some delegates attempted to regain control of the discussions, trying to bring order to the chaos. They reminded others that the summit was meant to achieve peace and that endless arguments would accomplish nothing. But the tension was too thick, and patience was in short supply. Factions that had been quiet for days now spoke loudly, some raising their voices above translators' capabilities. Misunderstandings became more common. Minor disagreements escalated quickly, turning into heated confrontations. It seemed that the absence of one calm, principled human had changed the dynamics entirely. Meanwhile, news of the human representative walking away began to circulate across the station. Observers, journalists, and aides spoke quietly in the hallways, spreading reports to their home worlds through secure channels. Some described the action as courageous, a rare act of integrity in a room filled with self-interest and subtle deception. Others criticized it, calling it stubborn or irresponsible. Regardless of opinion, the effect was undeniable. The human's departure had left a void, and without a voice of fairness, the council's discussions began to spin out of control. Arguments became sharper as the day progressed. Delegates no longer attempted to frame their positions politely. Accusations of cheating, manipulation, and hidden agendas flew across the table. Small factions, which had previously struggled to be heard, now shouted their grievances, frustrated by the dominance of larger, more powerful groups. Some delegates even accused each other of falsifying reports or twisting historical events. The noise, emotion, and tension built steadily, threatening to overwhelm the summit entirely. As the chaos grew, some delegates realized that the summit might collapse entirely if the situation continued unchecked. They tried to calm their colleagues, emphasizing shared goals and reminding everyone of the importance of peace. But without the human representatives' presence to model calm reasoning and fairness, their efforts were mostly ignored. Larger factions, accustomed to exerting influence through intimidation or cunning, refused to yield. Every attempt to moderate the discussion only fueled new conflicts, and the hall seemed to descend further into disorder. Observers in the galleries above the main chamber watched silently. Many were from worlds far from Earth, sending updates to leaders who could not be present. Some leaders expressed admiration for the human representative's decision to walk away, noting that it revealed the true intentions of certain factions. Others were frustrated, fearing that the summit's collapse could worsen regional instability or embolden aggressive factions. Despite differing opinions, everyone agreed that the council had entered uncharted territory. By mid-afternoon, the summit was barely recognizable. The formal structure of negotiation had collapsed. Delegates shouted over each other, waved documents in the air, and pointed fingers. Personal insults mixed with accusations of cheating and historical grievances. The translators struggled to keep up, often repeating phrases only to have them interrupted by the next outburst. It was no longer a summit. It had become a storm of chaos, fueled by mistrust, ambition, and the absence of the human voice that had provided balance. In the corridors outside the hall, aides and advisors hurried to their delegates, offering advice or whispering urgently. Some were nervous, afraid that their world's interests would be lost in the disorder. Others recognized the opportunity to gain advantage while the council struggled to maintain focus. Even outside observers noted that the departure of one human had created a ripple effect far larger than anyone had expected. The principle of integrity, when modeled effectively, had the power to expose weakness and dishonesty in ways no rules or protocols could. Themselves began to fracture into small groups, arguing amongst each other rather than presenting unified positions. Factions that had been aligned now questioned their alliances. Smaller factions, previously quiet and cautious, now felt pressure to speak loudly to ensure their survival. Larger factions saw the breakdown as an opportunity to secure maximum gain, no matter the cost. What had been a hopeful gathering now resembled a complex battlefield, where strategy, fear, and impatience ruled every interaction. As the day continued, it became clear that the summit could not be salvaged without a dramatic intervention. The council's purpose to establish peace and prevent further conflict was at risk. Delegates who had initially hoped for compromise began to see that the absence of a guiding voice had opened the door to chaos. Some factions tried to return to reason, proposing pauses or private discussions, but their efforts were mostly ignored. The noise, confusion, and mistrust had built to a level that could not easily be contained. Even the station's organizers began to realize the gravity of the situation. Security personnel monitored heated exchanges, preparing for possible escalation. Technical staff attempted to maintain order in communication channels. Observers took note, recording every heated argument for their leaders back home. The collapse of decorum in the hall was unprecedented. Delegates who had once been polite and careful now shouted, gestured aggressively, and interrupted each other constantly. The human representative's choice to walk away had revealed something powerful. Honesty and integrity could be threatening to those who thrived on manipulation. By evening, the summit had effectively reached a standstill. Delegates were exhausted, frustrated, and anxious. The formal agenda had been abandoned. Proposals were rejected or ignored, and accusations flew unchecked. It was clear that without a steadying presence, meaningful agreements could not be reached. Some delegates acknowledged quietly that the human representative had been the only one able to provide balance, fairness, and calm reasoning. Others, though unwilling to admit it openly, feared that his absence had exposed the limits of their own authority and influence across the galaxy. Transmissions from Horizon Point painted a dramatic picture. Leaders who had been following the summit in real time watched as debates escalated into shouting matches and procedural chaos. Many began to understand the significance of one human walking away. It was a signal that truth and principle could not be ignored, even in the most complex political environments. Some worlds began to reconsider their approach to alliances and diplomacy, realizing that manipulation and deceit would eventually be exposed. In the council chamber, the situation continued to deteriorate. Delegates argued over every minor detail, from trade routes to resource distribution, and even procedural rules became points of conflict. Small factions demanded recognition, while larger factions resisted any compromise. Chaos ruled over reason. Yet even in the disorder, some delegates paused to reflect. They understood that the summit had not failed simply because of arguments or disagreements, but because it lacked a foundation of honesty and fairness. The human representative had walked away, refusing to participate in discussions that ignored these principles, and his absence left a powerful impression on everyone present. As the night fell over Horizon Point, delegates left the hall reluctantly, some frustrated, some contemplative. Advisors spoke in hurried whispers, strategizing for the next day, while security personnel monitored the chambers for potential escalation. The human representative, meanwhile, remained calm, observing from the observation deck, watching the distant stars stretch across the infinite expanse of space. He understood that the council's collapse was not a failure in principle, but a necessary revelation. The weaknesses, manipulations, and selfish ambitions that had been hidden beneath formalities were now visible, and the path forward would require careful thought, honesty, and courage. By the end of the day, the human representative reflected on the events. The summit had not ended with agreement, but it had exposed the R. The morning after the collapse of the council arrived slowly over Horizon Point. The stars outside shimmered brightly against the blackness of space. Indifferent to the chaos that had unfolded within the station, delegates emerged from their quarters cautiously, some with heavy expressions, others with restless energy. The human representative moved quietly along the observation decks, looking out at the distant galaxies, taking in the vastness of space, and considering the events of the past days. He had seen the summit's collapse not as a failure, but as an inevitable consequence of the lack of honesty and fairness. Now, the question was what would come next. The council chamber, once filled with noise and argument, was eerily quiet. Delegates arrived slowly, some muttering under their breath, some speaking urgently to their aides. The air was tense, but there was a new awareness among them. The events of the previous day had forced every participant to reconsider their approach to diplomacy. They had witnessed a human act with unwavering principle, choosing integrity over convenience, and the impact was clear. Even the most stubborn factions were forced to recognize that manipulation and selfish gain could no longer guide their decisions without consequence. Representative took his seat once again, not with submission or compromise, but with calm determination. He understood that the future of the galaxy would depend on what happened next. If the delegates continued to fight among themselves, they could destroy any chance of lasting peace. But if they listened carefully, acted with honesty, and respected principles, the collapse of the summit could become a turning point, a moment of awakening that could lead to real progress. The first discussions of the day were cautious. Delegates spoke in measured tones, choosing their words carefully. There was still tension, but it was tempered by reflection. Many had realized that the absence of the human representative had exposed the fragility of the council and the consequences of ignoring truth. Some factions apologized quietly to each other for earlier confrontations, while others suggested ways to rebuild trust. Small gestures, like listening attentively or allowing others to speak without interruption, began to appear again in the chamber. The tone of the summit had shifted, subtly but unmistakably. The human representative observed all of this carefully. He knew that real change required more than words. It required consistency, patience, and courage. He spoke calmly when necessary, reminding delegates that fairness and honesty were not weaknesses, but strengths. He encouraged smaller factions to voice their concerns without fear, emphasizing that true stability could only be achieved when all voices were heard. Slowly, delegates began to respond, asking questions, clarifying points, and acknowledging mistakes. For the first time in days, the council felt like a forum for genuine dialogue rather than a battlefield of egos. Throughout the day, discussions turned to practical matters, trade agreements, defense cooperation, and shared resources. Delegates debated with intensity, but also with a new awareness of responsibility. They knew that their decisions would affect countless lives across countless worlds. The human representative continued to guide discussions subtly, not dominating them, but ensuring that fairness remained the focus. He asked thoughtful questions, encouraged compromise where possible, and reminded everyone that the goal was lasting peace, not immediate advantage. As the morning gave way to afternoon, delegates began to form new understandings. Some smaller factions, previously overlooked, were now given attention, their concerns addressed with respect. Larger factions adjusted their proposals to be more balanced, realizing that unchecked ambition would only lead to further conflict. The human representative's quiet influence, combined with the lessons learned from the previous day's collapse, began to create a new dynamic. For the first time, the council operated not out of fear, manipulation, or dominance, but out of cautious cooperation. One of the most remarkable shifts occurred when a faction that had been particularly aggressive in Comer. Previous discussions openly admitted their miscalculations. They acknowledged that their earlier proposals had been unfair and offered to revise them to reflect the interests of all parties. This act of humility surprised many delegates, and even more, it set a tone for the remainder of the summit. Others followed suit, proposing changes that emphasized shared benefits rather than individual gain. The human representative remained calm, encouraging these gestures without drawing attention to himself. His role was not to be applauded, but to ensure that fairness guided action. As the day progressed, the council began drafting a new framework for agreements. Instead of a rigid, top-down approach, discussions focused on collaboration, shared responsibility, and mutual respect. Delegates debated each clause thoroughly, with translators ensuring clarity across languages. The atmosphere, once tense and chaotic, grew more focused and purposeful. Every proposal was examined for fairness, every concern addressed with care, and every decision weighed for long-term impact. The human representative noted quietly that the council was slowly learning a crucial lesson. Integrity could create stronger agreements than power or manipulation ever could. Observers in the station's galleries took note of the changes. Across the galaxy, reports began to circulate that the summit, once teetering on collapse, was now finding a path toward resolution. Leaders of distant worlds marveled at the human representative's quiet influence, the fact that one individual, by refusing to compromise principles, had caused the council to reassess its methods and priorities. The ripple effect was profound. Diplomacy, they realized, was not merely about negotiation skills or strategy, but about the courage to act with honesty and integrity. Even in the most challenging circumstances. By late afternoon, the human representative suggested a small pause. Delegates used the time to confer privately, review their notes, and reflect on the discussions so far. Some factions, previously mistrustful of each other, found themselves agreeing on common points. Even the largest factions, which had attempted to dominate the talks, began to understand that cooperation offered benefits greater than unilateral advantage. The pause allowed tempers to cool, perspectives to realign, and priorities to be reconsidered. After the break, the council reconvened, and the tone was noticeably different. Proposals were presented with care, questions were asked thoughtfully, and responses were measured. The human representative continued to guide discussions subtly, highlighting fairness, encouraging compromise, and reminding delegates of the importance of integrity. As hours passed, agreements began to take shape, not perfect, but balanced and reasonable. Delegates who had been stubborn now listened more attentively, and those who had been overlooked finally had their voices heard. By evening, the council had drafted a preliminary agreement that addressed the key concerns of all parties. Trade routes were established with safeguards for smaller factions. Resource-sharing agreements were crafted with equity, and defense arrangements were designed to ensure mutual security rather than domination. The human representative reviewed the draft carefully, noting that while it was not perfect, it reflected a remarkable shift from the chaos of the previous day. It was a testament to the power of principle, patience, and courage. Delegates exchanged thoughtful looks. Some smiled subtly, relieved that progress had been made. Others remained serious, understanding the gravity of their decisions. The human representative remained calm, observing quietly, offering guidance only when necessary. His presence had transformed the council from a fractured, chaotic gathering into a forum, capable of meaningful, fair agreements. The lessons of the collapse had been absorbed, and the delegates had begun to act with integrity and responsibility. As night fell over Horizon Point, the human representative stood once again on the observation deck. He looked out at the endless stars, reflecting on the journey of the past days. The summit had been tumultuous, challenging, and at times disheartening. Yet through patience, integrity, and unwavering principle, he had guided the council toward a path of fairness and cooperation. The collapse of the summit had been a necessary lesson, a reminder that peace built on manipulation or selfish gain could never last. The preliminary agreement was not the final word, but it was a foundation upon which true peace could be built. Delegates would continue to refine it in the coming days, but the tone had shifted irrevocably. Honesty, fairness, and courage now guided the discussions. The human representative knew that the real work was ongoing, but he also understood that the hardest lesson had been learned. Integrity must come first, and compromise without principle is meaningless. As he walked through the quiet corridors of Horizon Point, he noticed delegates moving with purpose, discussing strategies calmly, listening attentively, and taking the time to understand each other. The air was still tense, but now it carried hope. Hope that the galaxy could move beyond manipulation, selfishness, and distrust. Hope that individuals, by acting with courage and integrity, could influence the course of events in profound ways. The human representative knew that his journey was not over, but he felt a quiet satisfaction in witnessing the first true steps toward lasting peace. By the end of the day, the council had emerged from the shadow of chaos into a space of cautious optimism. Delegates,